This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Becca Levy. She is the leading authority on how beliefs about aging influence aging and health. This is a topic that I love. Any type of topic that gets at the mind and how our mind can control so much. We want all these excuses. We want to blame everyone else. But inside of our mind is a lot of magic. Becca is a professor of epidemiology at the Yale School of Public Health and a professor of psychology at Yale. She's got the chops. She's done the homework. She's done the research. She's got great insights. Again, this is just one of these inspirational type conversations. When you wake up, including me, you means me too, when you wake up, there are so many opportunities to just get better. And in this case, I mean physically better by thinking it true. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my conversation with Becca Levy. This is a topic that my perspective on it, and the reason I wanted to do this interview is I saw the topic and I was like, I get this lady. I get where she's going. I already believe it 100%. And I was thinking to myself, why do I believe it? And I guess it's part instinct and part experience. But I do believe it. I believe that so much of this aging process is in the mind. You might end up asking me questions. It's a fascinating topic to jump into because, and I was actually thinking of a simple example that I use in my mind. Let's say a simple heuristic. You might disagree with me. You might call me crazy. Other people might disagree with me, but it's kind of like an old man action. Old man action. I'm in my early 50s. I've noticed that men, maybe in their late 20s or their 30s, they start dabbling in whiskey. They start drinking whiskey and they think whiskey is cool. But to me, whiskey is an old man exercise. I think there's all kinds of behaviors that we could all look at and maybe deduce or think something, and maybe some of them are accurate or not accurate. Maybe my whiskey one is completely crazy. But there are behaviors and ways of thinking that will keep us young, aren't there?
Well, I think there are a lot of messages in our culture that impact the meaning that we give to different ages. So as you said, the example with whiskey, so that might be something that some people associate with that age, and that becomes a behavior. So there are a lot of messages I have found that can impact how we think about aging and then how we actually age.
Let's just break it open, because to the big picture salvo, if you were meeting somebody in the elevator and they kind of wanted to know about your background and what you've uncovered and what you've unpacked, part of it would be on that elevator pitch that aging is controlled by our mind to some extent. Our thinking and our behaviors will play a direct role on our aging.
Right, exactly. Yes. I have definitely found evidence looking at different cultures and conducting different kinds of studies that these age beliefs can have a direct impact that we carry around in our mind, can have a direct impact on different types of health outcomes, especially as we get older. I've been able to look at that many different ways that kind of reinforce. We keep on finding sort of similar parallel findings that really show the power of age beliefs. So we know that if you look at lifespan, only about 25% is determined by our genes. 75% is determined by other factors. What I'm really interested in are those factors that we can have an impact on, that we can control, that are something that we can actively do something about.
What do you think the average person thinks that number is? They probably don't think it's 75%.
I think that is one of the many myths that I had a chance to explore in the book. I mean, there are many myths that we have about aging. One of them is that aging is determined by inevitable biological factors. I think a lot of us feel like we're born with a script of how we're going to age. What I found in my research is that, in fact, these age beliefs can have a really big impact on many different aspects of aging that we usually think about as only due to sort of biological factors, but we've been able to pull it apart in the research and really identify the role of the mind or these age beliefs.
Let's compare and contrast, since I happen to be in Asia, and I've spent a lot of time in Asia since 2013. Happen to be in Vietnam today, but I've spent a lot of time in Japan. I know you have spent some time in Japan as well. We could come at this topic from so many different angles and so many different vantages, but I thought jumping into Asia, jumping into Japan would be a good place to start. The way that you phrase it, the way that your research has uncovered it, if you're older in a place like Japan, you're not shunned. You're not necessarily stuffed off into an old folks' home. You very well could be, I'm a guy, so let's use guy as an example. You very well could be a 90-year-old rock star, so to speak, in Japan, where younger people look up to you. They want insights from you. They want to know about you. And this might not be the case exactly in America these days. Why don't you compare and contrast a little bit there?
Yeah, thank you for mentioning all that. It's interesting because the way that I actually got started in the topic of the impact of age beliefs is that in graduate school, I had the opportunity to go to Japan. My goal in going there was to try to understand why they have the longest lifespan in the world. And that's still the case. And I was really looking for factors in the culture that we may have some control over. And what I immediately noticed is actually exactly what you're talking about, is how different older people are treated in Japan than what I was used to observing in Boston, where I was living at the time. I was used to observing different aspects of ageism in the culture. And then when I arrived in Japan, I was really impressed at how differently people were treated. For example, I noticed that on television, centenarians and supercentenarians who are living to 110 and older were treated as celebrities on television. They have a national holiday celebrating older people. And there are many different ways that I noticed that older people are treated in a much more positive way. That actually launched my interest in the question of, is it possible that these age beliefs that exist in a culture that we know we can take in as young as age 3, and then they're reinforced over time. So is it possible that these age beliefs can actually impact our aging health and our longevity? That launched a series of studies I undertook to try to understand that question. What we found is that indeed that is the case, that it appears that these age beliefs can really have an impact on our aging health.
My standard response when you're in a place like Asia, see white guys on TV, and there's white guys running around Thailand and Singapore and Japan, less so in Vietnam, less so in China. But people are curious when they meet you. And my standard response that I give, I'm sure you'll appreciate this, people say, well, how old are you? Which is a very common thing to ask somebody in Asia. In America, that's not typically asked. A stranger will ask you out of the blue, hey, how old are you? My response is quite simple. I'm 19. It speaks to a little bit about how I view myself, too. I figure, well, until it all breaks down and I can't do physical things like a 19-year-old, etc., why not be 19 in my mind, so to speak?
What you say about that it's much more accepted to ask that question. Sometimes it's thought of as rude to ask it in the United States. But yeah, the question is, why would that be? I mean, if age is just a normal part of the lifespan and we celebrate each age that we're in at the moment and think about some of the challenges, but also some of the things to celebrate, it should be fine to talk about it and ask. So that's interesting that you've noticed that difference.
I'll share something else too, and I guess somebody could immediately take this as controversial. There's a men and women thing that happens also in a place like Asia that's different than America. I think you will find women that are younger have more interest in men that are older too. And I'm not trying to sound unusual or anything, but it's definitely something that you see in the culture where I think guys realize this, all guys realize this, that women typically mature faster. We're basically crazy people until we get later in life. But women, I've noticed in Asia, seem to want to have that experience of being around a more stable mind versus Mike at age 23, who's crazy.
Do you think it's only that direction?
I would guess primarily it's that direction, which is unfair, of course. We're just sitting here as scientists kind of talking about experiences and things we've seen, but that is definitely something that exists. In a place like Vietnam, part of the culture, part of the language is when somebody meets you, they need to accurately guess as to whether or not you are younger or older than they are. Depending on how much older you are, there's like 3 different levels of pronouns that you're supposed to use based on what the age might be.
Right. That's a great observation. And I think you're right that language is a big part of how a culture communicates how they think about the role of aging and the importance of aging and the meaning given to it. And so that's a great example of the level of respect that's often given in Asian cultures, which there's not many differences in pronouns that I've noticed in the United States. In fact, what I've noticed that I read about in the book is there's this phenomenon of elder speak. I think it's very common. I find I do this myself is for when a person is talking to an older person to actually adjust their language as if they're speaking almost to a child. So speaking with shorter words and things like, oh, you look so cute today, or how are we feeling? So using a pronoun which includes you with them, with an older person. So there's this tendency that I find that sometimes the other day I was actually talking to a 99-year-old and I found myself using this language without realizing it. When I heard myself using the simplified language, I actually had to take a step back and correct myself and say, okay, well, that's not how I want to talk to this person. I have a lot of respect for this person. My language isn't communicating that. So I had to think about if I were talking to a peer, how would I be talking to them at this moment? And I was able to take a course correction and adjust language. What you're saying that you observed is really interesting. And that's something that has, I think, real implications on the meaning we give aging.
Doing this podcast, too, I've spoken to so many different individuals, probably many of your peers. I have to say, the people that are older, 70, 80, I had a few, I think, over 90 on this podcast. There's an interesting something that happens. I'm sure some of the most popular guests, it's almost like they have no filter in the sense that they're not worried about anything anymore. They're just telling you exactly how it is from their perspective. Everyone loves that.
Yeah, that can be a really wonderful quality that people grow into. In fact, in the book, one of the things that I wrote about is some of the qualities that we don't necessarily always know get better. We have a lot of myths about aging that tend to be pretty negative. For example, there's the idea that older people become less creative or older people have higher levels of mental illness. But in fact, there's a lot of studies that show that the prevalence of mental illness can often go down in later life and that creativity can, often stay the same, or there's a lot of examples of it increasing in later life. One of the qualities that has been found to improve in later life is ability to solve conflicts and to have life review, think back about the things that you've learned from over the lifespans. So what you're observing matches some of the science of some of the qualities that we know can improve in later life.
Let me keep you at the Japan part of your initial inspiration. Speak to me about the physical aspects. I think anyone that's traveled Japan and frankly most of Asia, okay, there's different body shapes than a typical American. Asian people are typically going to be thinner. Japanese are, I think, from cradle to grave, the Japanese are pretty uniformly fit. I think it's just culturally, there's going to be outliers, of course. That's not the case in America. Why don't you speak to also some of the physical aspect of aging in Japan and what you saw?
I think what you observed is definitely some of the aspects of the culture that also support physical health. In my research, one of the things that I find that is really important is to pull apart the different factors that can contribute to aging health. One of the things that I try to do is to look at whether it's possible that above and beyond some of the biological advantages, we still see that these age beliefs make an impact above and beyond those factors. Another thing that is important to point out is I found in my research that the age beliefs impact health behaviors, which impact health. You could think about age beliefs as an upstream factor, which can impact a lot of different factors, such as how healthy people eat, whether they exercise, whether they take prescribed medications, because I found that these age beliefs act as almost a lens that people take in the world and then act on, that if we can improve our age beliefs, we have found that those can lead to improvements in some of the health behaviors, which in turn can lead to some of the health outcomes.
You're kind of getting at, I guess, though I'm going to reduce it for a second. It's almost like positivity versus negativity. Depending on how we frame the world through our lens, a more positive outlook going through life has a greater chance of giving us longevity, lifespan, actual years, actual extra years by having that positive mental framework versus the negative framework.
Yes, I think that's true. I would add that the research that I conduct is actually specific to these cultural age beliefs. It isn't just having a positive outlook. Somebody could actually be a little bit grumpy, but if they manage to take in a lot of positive age beliefs, we have found that those age beliefs above and beyond a positive outlook can lead to health benefits. There's a synergy. So I think when people have a positive outlook, they're more likely to sort of reinforce positive images of aging, and that can sort of reinforce a positive outlook. There's something specific I have found that these images of aging themselves that seem to actually make a difference. So if somebody takes in or reinforces more positive age beliefs, we found that that can have a number of different positive health benefits.
Why don't you throw out a couple examples of different age beliefs that you're speaking of so people can kind of wrap their arms around it?
One of the ways in our studies that we get at people's age beliefs is we just ask people, when you think about an old person, what are the first 5 words or phrases that come to mind? We say, don't think about it too much. Just tell us the first 5 words, our first 5 phrases that come to mind. Some of the most common beliefs that come up in our studies in the United States are like senility, forgetfulness, and frailty. First images that people tend to mention, first words tend to be negative. The good news is that most people can also bring up positive age beliefs. It may not be the first thing that they mention. Often by the end, people will say something like wisdom or something that's considered positive, creative. If we can reinforce and strengthen those positive age beliefs, that can bring about positive changes in physical outcomes and mental health outcomes and in cognitive outcomes. There's some malleability of those age beliefs, which I think is really important.
Is Japanese culture ground zero for the real straightforward application of positive beliefs?
Japan is definitely one of the cultures that we've observed that has these positive age beliefs. I've also found there's some cultures within the United States that there can be regional differences or differences in different cultural communities within a country as well. In the book, I also write about some examples of India having positive age beliefs, some examples in Africa. There are a number of regions which have developed more positive age beliefs. And then, unfortunately, there are a number of regions who seem to have grown these more negative age beliefs as well. But they can change.
There's so many issues here that people will just assume the wrong way. It's like, oh, as I get older, I'm going to lose my memory. But the mind's a muscle. If you keep using it, and I had a conversation once on this podcast with a guy named Vernon Smith, who won the Nobel Prize in economics. He was 90 plus. He started telling me some story about when he was a teenager, and it was just so vivid. We all mistakenly believe certain things about aging that when you dig into the work, for example, like your work, memory does not have to dry up and go away. If you let it dry up and go away, it will.
Yes, that's a great observation. That's true. I think one of the most common negative beliefs about aging or negative stereotypes about aging is that memory inevitably declines in all older people. We know from the science that that's just not true. We know that there are many different types of memory. Procedural memory, which would be something like remembering how to ride a bike, that seems to stay the same over the lifespan. And then there's other types of memory that tend to improve in later life, such as the ability to learn new vocabulary words. So there's this whole variability of types of memory. Also, as you mentioned, there's these great examples of older people who have excellent memories. Somebody who I really enjoyed talking to in writing the book was an 84-year-old actor named John who decided to take on this memory task of memorizing a 60,000 word poem.
Wow.
Right. He actually memorized it word for word. And he doesn't actually have like a photographic memory. It was really that he just took on this challenge and really worked hard at it. Something that I found was really interesting about him was he had his own positive age belief that it really inspired and motivated him. So he told me that as he was taking on this memory challenge, he thought about this cellist that he really loved, who played beautiful sonatas into his 80s and 90s. He had this image of this very creative older person. He drew on that to inspire his own wonderful memory task. And he performed it over a few days and just did a great job with this performance.
On the flip side of this, though, too, the self-fulfilling prophecy, you use the example was somebody could be grumpy, but as long as they have the positive age behaviors, they'll be fine. But the self-fulfilling prophecy could be the negative age beliefs. And that literally can bring the person down and reduce lifespan, can it?
Yeah, unfortunately, you're right. In my journey of doing this research, the way that it actually began was observing exactly what you're talking about. I was in a store with my grandmother. At the time, she was this really fit 75-year-old who loved walking everywhere. And we were walking into a store. She tripped over a crate that the store manager had left in the middle of the aisle. And it had a sharp edge and it ripped into her leg and she had this deep cut. And it was just this terrible event. I helped her up. We were trying to leave the store and we saw the store manager and we told him what had happened. We didn't want somebody else to trip over it. His first reaction was to say to her, "Why are you walking around? Old people shouldn't be walking around. Obviously, she's got problems. It's her fault for walking around in the store." So it was this awful, awful event. And then to add on it, he blamed her for this awful event happening. So not only was it rude, but it was just really ageist. What I observed was that his awful messaging to her really had this negative impact on her. So even though her leg healed, it turned out to actually be somewhat of a superficial wound that did heal. The power of his message really impacted her and it made her not want to do her usual walks. It made her feel less good about herself as an older person, really had an impact on her self-efficacy or how much she wanted to interact with some of her friends. I observed the impact of these messages can be really quite profound. And that's been reinforced in my research. I've been able to show that these negative messages about aging can really have a profound impact on many aspects of our health. What's also found in the research is that we can switch the age beliefs. We can reinforce positive age beliefs that can bring about positive changes. So it's not set in stone, these negative messages. We can have some control over their impact.
Well, what's interesting about that example with the store manager, look at his beliefs. His beliefs will become self-fulfilling if he doesn't figure out why he's wrong, because we're all aging. We all got the same problem. If that's how he thinks at his 30 or 40 or 50-something age, he's not going to be on a really good journey as he gets older.
That's a great point. I actually hadn't thought about it that way. You're right. He should improve his beliefs about aging, not only to be a kinder person, but also for his own health.
Yeah, he's not going to be young forever. I mean, let me ask a controversial question and contrasted to Japan, contrasted to other cultures to America. Was there anything in your research that uncovered or compared and contrasted the use of antidepressants? Are the Japanese, for example, big users of antidepressants?
My research didn't look at that question, but that's actually a really good question. I know that there is some really interesting research on a slightly different topic, but has to do with medications, with pain medications that are taken in Japan versus other places. I did see a recent study that compared experiences of pain in different cultures, taking of pain medications, and it was found that there is actually much lower levels in Japan.
Lower levels of taking pain medication.
Yeah. The thought was that this actually may be another way that a study with older women, and one hypothesis of why that may be the case is, again, because of the more positive age beliefs might have a physical health advantage and reduce the need for some of the treatments for chronic pain.
What do you mean when you say that age is a socially fluid construct?
We know that there is no single biomarker of aging. It's not like you can take some tests and figure out exactly what somebody's age is. Age itself has many factors that go into it.
All we really have is non-scientists. We just know how old we are.
Right. We can ask people, but in terms of, we're not like trees that we have number of rings that you can measure the number of rings that we have.
It only tells us so much. The physical age of any individual, comparing and contrasting, if we don't know how they've led their life, doesn't tell us so much.
Exactly. As we talked about, only about a quarter of aging health and longevity seems to be determined by the genes that we're born with. There is a lot of room for us to think about the 75% that contributes that are due to sort of environmental factors and social factors. One of the things that I found in my research is that one of those pieces that we can actually have some control over are these beliefs about aging.
Let me take it to young people for a moment. We're in an interesting point in time. You can tell in my questions, and as I laid out in the setup, I'm with you on where you've gone. What's interesting about your work, trying to get young people to understand these issues, let's say, for example, to get them past stereotypes. So they're just not thinking, oh, that's Granny and she's useless and all that kind of stuff. The interesting thing that's happening right now, though, from my perspective, is there's almost a battle of ages going on right now, because the power and the wealth in America, for example, and I think this probably goes across the world, is situated in the hands of 80-year-olds. The typical 25 to 30-year-old does not have the same power and wealth that 80-year-old had at age 25. There's a huge disparity where younger people today have less wealth, less opportunity, less power. How do you perceive that in terms of, okay, you don't want these young people to have these negative stereotypes about older folks. But on the flip side, I could actually see how some young people today are feeling a little bit left out.
I think there is a lot of age segregation that exists today. In the United States specifically, we've gone from being one of the most age-integrated countries to one of the most age-segregated countries. I think part of that is these negative messages about aging that polarize the generations. What you say about the distribution of wealth, I mean, so there are certainly examples of very wealthy older people, but unfortunately, there's a lot of examples of older people who live in poverty, who can't afford medications and food, and huge diversity of situations for older people. What I've found, so I teach a lot of younger adults in my classes. I have found that when I start the semester, a lot of people have these beliefs about aging that they've taken in from the culture that tend to be not always the most positive, and they don't always realize the amount of ageism that can exist in our culture.
What's a good example right there? They come into your class early on, early semester. What are some examples from a young person? I mean, because I can't assume that I'm in their mind. What are some examples you see in the field right then and there in the classroom?
I think for the most part, it isn't even that they're thinking about these negative beliefs. I think about aging. I think for most of them, they actually just don't think about it. They don't think about older people much. And I think part of that is because in the United States, we have such a age segregated country. And also, I think because structural ageism is so ingrained in our culture that it's really hard to see it. What I've found is that when these students learn about it and they take on the tools that allow them to see the different examples of ageism and start to think about some of the positive older role models that they have in their own lives, what I found is that there's this real switch that happens over the semester. So I find that by the end of the semester, these students are noticing examples of ageism just about everywhere. They also are really angry about it and really want to find ways to do it. And we know that there, as you're mentioning, there's just been a lot of social movements that have really been supported and led by younger people. So I think that really a role for them in becoming allies and trying to reduce ageism and improve how we think about aging.
Let me share an example. I'm Gen X, so I'm not 20 and I'm not 80. As I laid out at the beginning of this conversation, I'm right there with you. I'll share an experience or something that I've learned, we could call it a hack, about how I have maintained a youthful belief system. I do yoga, I do Pilates, I work out. I'm pretty good at it. So I'm around a lot of women in their 20s and 30s who are really good at it too. But I'm better than a lot of them. Most of the teachers are better than me for sure, but I'm good enough, really good enough to where you get this interesting synergy to where both sides have a mutual respect. Then something interesting and I think magical happens. People don't think about age. They just think about, well, okay, we're working out together. Can you do it? Can you not do it? Are you getting better? The age part's not relevant.
That's a great observation. In the book, I present what I call our ABC tools to bolster positive age beliefs. One of the tools is to improve or increase our awareness of intergenerational contacts that are helpful. I ask people just to think about their 5 closest friends and think about their age. Most people, including myself, tend to think about their first friends tend to be within 5 years of their own age. We know that there's real advantages of people of different ages getting together. And there's always this opportunity to find activities that are meaningful, that bring together people of different generations, that are built on common interests like Pilates. Exercise is a great way to interact with people. And it's exactly as you say, when you start to bond with people over common, shared, meaningful activities, that's a great way to become a mentor to younger people and to find older people that can inspire you. So I think find peers that share common experiences of aging. I think that's just a great way to go forward and try to find ways to interact with people.
I find in my situation, it's not even necessarily mentor or older or younger. It just becomes more equal. As I age, I'm sure at some stage of the game, they'll be like, well, hold on, who's the older guy? Let me go broader for a second and just bring in some more details. Back to Japan. Are there any things that I did not ask about, things that you could share, observations on the ground, field research, that really helped to distinguish why the Japanese are so good on the aging side, on the mind side, their belief sets? Why are they so good? Are there any other examples you want to share?
One of the chapters in the book, I focused on longevity, which is something that I think is just fascinating because it's really one of the places where we see that psychological factors, including age beliefs, can have a big impact. In writing that chapter, I worked with a Yale undergraduate who's Japanese, who was living in Japan at the time. And so together we conducted some studies on these supercentenarians that are living in Japan today. In the book, I talk about a couple of examples of these wonderful people that Japanese older people. So, for example, the longest living person in the world that we talked to is this woman, Kane Tanaka, who lives in Japan. We talked to some of her relatives, and there was this wonderful biography that was written in Japanese that we read and talked to some of the people that work with her. One of the things we observed are that she was very active and really enjoyed the age that she is now, had these positive age beliefs that were reinforced by her family and the culture that she kind of embraced. It was great to see this example of this really vibrant set of beliefs that went with the longest living woman who happens to be living in Japan.
In your research so far, this will change as the decades roll on for sure, because I'm going to use some type of tech device connected to whatever type of networks we have for the rest of my life. I will. So I'm a Gen X guy, that's for sure, be doing that. Some of the older people now, I'm curious, are they using tech? Or most of the field research and the much older people, they're aging well, mentally sharp. Are they tech users yet?
We talked about memory loss as being one of the strong negative age beliefs that can be defied when we look at some of the science. Another one is that older people have trouble with technology and don't use technology. And there's just a lot of surveys that show that most older people are very comfortable with technology, can learn how to embrace and take advantage of technology. And in fact, there's this MIT professor who was a pioneer in her 80s in developing new nanotechnologies. They're examples of older people who really embrace technology. And in fact, one of the things I think that's interesting in writing the book, I spoke to this young man named Quinn, who he told me this story of how that was one of his strongest stereotypes, or one of his strongest negative age beliefs, was that older people are not able to handle technology. And he noticed in his own behavior that he's quite good at taking on different technological challenges. And so he would often be asked to help different people. And he said if somebody asked him for help who was his own age, he would show them how to actually fix whatever the bug was or the problem was. But he said if it was an older adult who asked him a question, what he would do is he would take over. So he'd take over their smartphone or their computer and actually make the change for them. He realized that when he became aware of his age beliefs, he actually worked for this organization called Grey Panthers, which helped him become aware of all the different ways that ageism can operate. Quinn found that when he became aware of that negative age belief about technology, he was able to shift it he actually started to realize that he could teach older people as well to take on technology challenges and fix it themselves so that they could go forward and be more empowered in their life and their use of technology.
Was the Japanese example your trigger, or was there something else that woke you up to the idea that you should go down this path?
I mean, it was the experience of going to Japan that really inspired the question, but it was actually when I came back from Japan, I had this burning desire to understand if there was really this impact of culture on our aging health, but I had no idea how to study it. I searched a number of different methods and tried to really pull apart how I could study it. What I actually found was I found this community in the town of Oxford, Ohio. I found that in this town, this researcher a couple of decades ago had asked everybody who was 50 and older to describe their age beliefs. I went to the people who had originally collected this information about the people in this town, and I said, is it possible that I could connect these age beliefs to their longevity information? Is it okay if I see whether these age beliefs that they reported a few decades ago has had an impact on their aging health? I was able to find this data set put together by the government that tracks how long people live. So I was able to match these early expressed age beliefs in this town to their longevity. What I found was that those who had taken in more positive age beliefs at the beginning of the study actually had a 7.5-year median survival advantage over those in the town who had taken in more negative age beliefs. When I found that result, I thought, gosh, there's really something here that we really need to understand. Is there something that we can do about it? What is the mechanism that's operating? Is this something that we see in other parts of the world? That actually started this whole set of questions that I explore in the book.
I've written some investment books. I've had the chance to stumble upon rare data sets that I knew people might have known about it, but they weren't really doing anything with it. So I knew I was going to have the chance to push these data sets with my megaphone. So you must have really had that feeling, that aha moment of like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I just found this data set.
Yes, well, exactly. Well, first I found it and then I wasn't sure I was going to be able to track everybody down and figure out their longevities. It was a couple of moments. It was the moment of realizing that this data set existed. And there was another moment that followed when I realized I could actually follow how long these people lived with another data set. So I was able to actually bring those two data sets. Yeah. And so it was this moment of a couple of moments of, yes, this is going to be really cool if we can find this and track this information. You're right. It's almost like discovering the world, actually being a sleuth and figuring out the clues and bringing them together can be one of the really exciting parts of science.
Yes. I was once asked a question. I met Mikhail Gorbachev. He was working with an interpreter. It was just kind of a meet and greet type thing. And he was told that I write these investment books. There was this whole translation process with Russian. He asked me how I did it in Russian, and it was translated. And then I said, well, I'm very good at digging. He started laughing, no translation needed. So I realized it was all part of the game. We had to do the translation. But being like an archaeologist, you've been able to find other data sets like that? Or was that like the golden one that inspired other work?
That's a good way to put it, being like an archaeologist. That's a nice image. But after I looked at that data set, another things that I enjoy doing is to look at different methodologies to really understand a question. And so after exploring that longitudinal data set, I have found some other longitudinal data sets that have found very similar findings, but I've also conducted experiments or scientific studies where I can randomly assign people to different conditions and conduct clinical trial almost. So we can randomly assign people to different positive age belief conditions and then look before and after they've been exposed to different age beliefs. So we can actually see whether there are, for example, improvements in, say, walking speed or balance after somebody's been exposed to positive age beliefs. And that can be a much more controlled setting. So we can really pull apart whether it's the age beliefs themselves. What I found in my research is that using these different methodologies, using the example of Oxford, Ohio, and following people over time, but also bringing people into an experimental laboratory, we can also find very similar sets of findings, which really reinforces my belief that there is something going on here. If we find similar findings with these different methods, it really supports the idea that these cultural age beliefs that we all have can really have an impact on our health.
Yeah, it's an interesting way that you lay out your background and your process, because some people might be listening and they might be thinking, well, these are just her opinions. She's talked to a few people, but if you listen closely, as you just described it, you start to realize, hold on, this is like science nerd here who's gathering data nonstop, who is trying to be terribly objective. I'm sure you would be offended if somebody was saying you were subject about this topic, that you probably have got more data in your pocket about this subject that we could even share for probably hours and hours on this show, is my guess.
I do have quite a few studies that support these ideas. And actually, that was one of the things that I'm really excited about in writing this book, is that until now, I've really been focused on writing for scientific journals, which is great for kind of moving the science forward. And unfortunately, I was finding that those results were not getting out to a lot of people that could really benefit from the age beliefs research. I was really excited about taking on this challenge of trying to translate the findings into stories and ideas about tools that people can take on to improve age beliefs, and really share the research and the ideas and the stories with people who aren't necessarily going to go to a university library and pick up a scientific journal, but are interested in something that's more tangible or approachable.
I feel lucky in the sense that my great-grandmother got to age 101. My one grandmother got to age 100. My other grandmother got to age 94. I've always used that as a baseline. I've just said to myself, okay, maybe I've got some good genetics here. So I figure, well, why not try to take advantage of the luck that I was given? Because I could otherwise just be some guy who's running around partying all the time and gained too much weight and living the hard life and all that kind of fun stuff, and completely throw away the genetics part, the genetic advantage. I just love this idea that our attitudes, our beliefs on aging can affect how long we live. It's such a simple thing to say. I'm sure there's going to be some people out there that are skeptical. They're going to be like, nah, I wanted to believe it. So I'm like lapping it up because I already want to believe it. You're already confirming what I already theorize in my own mind.
I'm glad you brought up this idea of genetic advantages. It sounds like you have great genes that will give you an advantage. And in our research, I have found that even goes both directions. People who've been born with some risky genes for dementia, if they take on the positive age beliefs, it can still give them health advantages. And we've also found that some people who are born with beneficial genes that contribute to aging cognition and health, if they take on the positive age beliefs, there can be this synergy of the positive age beliefs and the beneficial genes. There is this really nice interaction of advantages that can come from the positive age beliefs and beneficial genes.
You said something earlier, you were talking about different generations communicating with each other. I feel lucky to do this podcast. I get to talk to all types of people running the age spectrum. It's really tough if you think about it. Someone who's going to be a college freshman, for all intents and purposes, I mean, college freshman is going to be focused on one thing. They're going to be focused on their age group right then and there, and then into your 20s. I mean, it's really difficult unless there's something that breaks people out of that mindset of staying only inside their age cohort or their generation. It's really difficult to break outside that.
Exactly. And especially with all of the age segregation that exists in the United States.
When you say age segregation, let me make sure that there's not a definition there. I'm just assuming I know what it means, but is there something specific there that I should know?
Well, I think it's exactly what you're talking about. I think it's the idea that there's a lot of ways that we stay within our own age cohort. I mean, there's a lot of reinforced messages that there are advantages to being with their own cohort. And you see that just with social interactions, both in person, but also in social media. Most people's interactions tend to be people close to their own age. That's very easy to do, but there are certain advantages of finding ways to become aware of what's happening and then forming ties with people of different ages. So we know one of the best ways to overcome ageism is for younger people to take on positive older role models or strengthen their portfolio of positive images, as I call it in the book. There's ways to actively become aware of it and then find ways to take on more positive age beliefs and positive older role models that we know can benefit people's future aging health.
This is going to vary across cultures. I think America might be one of the toughest places to break out of this because, I mean, my experience in growing up in the States is, think back to high school. It's like, oh my gosh, a senior was dating a junior. It's like, this is a complete chaos. I can't believe somebody is dating somebody 1 year younger than they are.
Right, right. Yes, you're right. There are really big cultural differences. I think that we can learn from different cultures. So I think in the United States, as you say, there are a lot of examples of ageism and separation of generations, but I think we can learn quite a bit from other cultures and other times in our history too, when there has been a lot more embracing of aging across generations.
Becca, really cool stuff. The book, Breaking the Age Code, How Your Beliefs About Aging Determine How Long and Well You Live. Very straightforward message. You got the data chops, so people are got to dive in. If they want to prove it to themselves, you've done the work. You can go comb through your mind, so to speak, save a little time in doing the research themselves, which would probably take decades. You've given everyone a shortcut, so to speak.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, it's great to talk to you. And I love your observations of different cultures. Very, very relevant, very important.
Thank you. Is there a place you would like to send people? Is there a website you want? I mean, the book at Amazon and all that kind of stuff, but is there a website you would like to send people to?
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that shout out. Yes, I just developed a website and it's my name. So it's Becca-Levy.com. We do have different links to independent booksellers and different ways that people can find the book, Breaking the Age Code. So yeah, thank you so much for mentioning that.
Hey, thanks for coming on. I hope I at least showed some education to dive into your world, to keep you motivated.
Definitely. It was great to talk to you. Thank you so much for taking the time.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.